Moderating the conversation tonight is Dr. Joseph Fischel, a professor at Yale's Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program. Through this conversation, we all hope to learn more about ways in which sexual assault and rape are being addressed or not on our college campuses. Before we begin, I'd like to thank several individuals and organizations that have made this series happen. This lecture series is being generously supported by JCC member David Beckerman and the Beckerman Family Foundation. It is also being supported by TD Bank as our series sponsor, and tonight's panel is being sponsored by Coachman Square of Woodbridge. Thank you for helping to bring events such as this one to JCC. Finally, I'd like to let you know that this panel is just the first of our 3 lecture series. On Thursday, May 14th, we'll be hosting Art Spiegelman, author of the critically acclaimed Mouse graphic novels. And on June 25th, join us for a screening of the popular documentary Mortified Nation, followed by chronicles adults who read from their childhood diaries in front of audiences of strangers. If we have any volunteers, please step up now. We're very excited about these upcoming events and hope that you will join us for them. Enjoy the panel.
Hi, good evening. So first, thank you to Anne Graham and JCC for organizing this event and bringing us here. Thank you to the kind man who introduced us, whose name I couldn't catch. Bob, thank you. And thank you to Emily and Alexandra in advance for all the wisdom and energy they brought to these issues and all the wisdom and energy they're gonna share with us tonight. And thank you guys. You're small, but you'll be vivacious. Great. So I'll ask several questions, and then we'll open it up to you. Yeah? Yep. Okay. So 8 of the 10 that I've prepared are for both panelists, but the first 2 are specific to each of you, so we'll start there. So, and kind of some ground clearing. So, this is for Alexandra. So, Alexandra is a co-founder of the organization called Know Your 9. And I was hoping you would tell us about the 9, right? Like what the 9 refers to, and perhaps to get at the question another way, and something we hear from critics all the time, why are university administrators dealing with sexual assault at all? Why shouldn't sexual assault be reported directly to the police, right? Aren't we doing kind of due process and justice to the accused and a moral disservice to the alleged victim, right? Okay.
Sure, yeah, that's a lot of questions. Just like to start. So, right, I think that most people, when they hear rape or they hear about sexual assault, immediately think call the cops. That rape is a crime and a crime only. And I think what that provides is that gender-based violence is also a threat to civil rights. And the logic, sort of formally in the law, understands that someone who is harassed or assaulted sexually is just assaulted or harassed on the basis of their sex, and that is a form of sex discrimination, which on university campuses cannot be tolerated by the administration under Title IX of 1972 Education Amendments, which is a civil rights law that guarantees equality to women on campus. The way that I think actually makes a little bit more sense intuitively is that it's really hard to learn when you share a hallway with your abusive ex-partner. It's really hard to study in a class where the professor is harassing you. And so given that women are disproportionately victimized, there are also male and gender non-conforming victims, female offenders, but disproportionately women are impacted by these harms, such that if you kind of take it from a macro perspective, women students are facing obstacles and their male peers simply are not. And that's both a shame on campuses for individual students' education, and it also means that a whole generation is going out into public life where women are a couple steps behind. And none of this ever precludes the possibility of police involvement at the same time. I can rant about why I don't think that that's such a great idea for many victims, but someone can report both to the police and to schools. A lot of people are choosing to report just to schools because universities are really uniquely situated to address their needs. So, when we think of rape as a crime, the sort of party to that is the state. The state brings the lawsuit to vindicate its own interests. But often, in the aftermath of violence, what a victim most wants is just to, change his or her dorm room so that they don't have to be right next to the person who assaulted them, or to have access to mental health care. And a university is actually much better positioned to provide for those needs than the police would be.
So it's a question for Emily, and maybe it picks up on the kind of disproportionate women problem, right? Emily, in 2014, you published this book, Sticks and Stones, about bullying culture in schools and among school children. And the question I have is, so often in our activism and policy recognitions, everything's sort of siloized. There's a problem here, and a problem here, and a solution here, and a solution here. And the question I want to ask is, in undertaking this research on the book, do you see any connections between what you found in schools, primary and secondary schools, and what we find on campus?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the really common types of bullying has to do with kids' sexuality. It can be, calling a kid an insult related to being gay, or it can be what increasingly kids, I think, teenagers call slut shaming, where you're essentially attacking a girl for appearing to be sexually active, whether she is or not. And so those two are forms of sex discrimination, and some of the remedies available to kids in middle school and high school who experience that type of bullying are actually more robust, legally speaking, than if you experience bullying and it has nothing to do with sex discrimination. So there are kids who have been severely bullied for being gay or perceived as gay who've won major judgments against school districts, and that's one way that Title IX, the same law, has been enforced at the secondary school level because it also applies at that level. In the Title IX context for universities, the way in which the understanding of Title IX that Alexandra just laid out for you is one that has come from us, not from lawsuits and courts, but from a government agency, from the Department of Education. It's their job to interpret Title IX. For many years, the main reason I think any of us, and certainly true for me, knew about Title IX had to do with sports teams. It was about whether the women, crew team was getting as much resources as the men. But in the last few years, especially since 2011, the Office of Civil Rights in the Federal Department of Education has really been putting schools on notice that they have a set of obligations under Title IX to investigate complaints of sexual harassment and assault and to do something about them. It's not that schools had zero responsibility before, but this has really kind of upped the ante of their awareness, put them on the hook, and as I'm sure some of you know, there have been many stories about particular cases, and increasingly students are bringing Title IX complaints against their schools to the federal government. And then that gives the federal government some leverage to come in and look at what the schools are doing and try to see if their procedures are adequate. And then we've had some questions about whether the government is going too far, whether there's overreach, and whether the schools, some of them are now tilting too far toward victim-centered approaches and away from the rights of the accused. So all which is to say, we're in the middle, I think, of a period of change of how we deal with this issue on college campuses, and actually, in some ways, it's kind of culturally related to some of the changes we're seeing at the high school and middle school level as well.
So as I was thinking these questions, I was looking at my own work and the kind of people that have secretaries for Slavic in my research and then also like popular media coverage, social media coverage, sexual assault, sexual misconduct, and like there always seems to be two registers, and they're polarized, and so I think there's like this sort of sex panic register and the gross neglect register. Right? So the sex panic register is you're saying like the states are overreaching, the universities are overreaching. This is our colleague Jennifer Linfeld, right? We're going to get expelled for kissing people without consent.
You're not going to get expelled for kissing people.
Correct. That was my hypothetical. Right? Or at a state level, right? This teenager is now a registered sex offender. right? So the kind of panic, this is all too much, we're going too far. And then you have this other story, which is, right, sexual assault is trivialized, we're not paying enough attention, we're demonizing victims, right? There's underreporting is the problem. And so I guess the question is, why this polarized and currently polarized discourse, and how might we or should we try to de-dramatize or de-escalate?
You have a good answer to that. I know you do.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I haven't thought about how that's coming about, and I think that the way to solve it doesn't go directly to the cause, and the cause is what they're going to get at. So I think that part of what happens here is that I think that it is true that there is gross neglect. So I think that colleges and universities, while they are certainly getting better, and very quickly, I think that we're dealing with a very different terrain than we were in 2011. We're still really mistreating a lot of victims. That concern that students sort of speak out about is then sort of goes through this media machine, which picks out all of the juiciest stories. And I mean that in two ways. I mean that both that the story of the victim is never, Emily and I were talking about this earlier, is never, what hit to your bank account happened after you were assaulted and you had to pay for services out of pocket. It's never what happened to your GPA and your career prospects. It's never what happened to your friendships. It's tell me what happened that night, who put what where, how much did you eat? That's the question that the media wants to ask the victim. And then it finds these cases where there's a compelling, it's always a case where the victim is seeking suspension or expulsion for his or her offender, never one where they're saying, I just want services. And then the media goes through all of the text messages and tries to figure out from their G-chats whether a rape occurred. And that I don't think is representative of the harms that victims are bringing to the light, but it's what makes for good reading, right? It's not that interesting to read a story about sort of how mundane violence is. And then I think what you get from that is the people who look at the media stories and say, oh my goodness, our daughters, everyone is a sex monster. Or says, look at these poor boys, they're getting expelled for kissing someone. And because they are building policies off of a really distorted vision of the problem. I think that the practical thing that we should be doing here is that we should be making sure that these procedures work really well for both students who report and students who are accused. And I think that that's actually not that hard to do. There's a lot of concern about failures in the process now that might not give accused students the chance to sort of present evidence, to be aware of their rights as they're going through. The narrative is that they're trying to witch hunt out for these boys. And while I think that that narrative is exaggerated, I think that the best way to deflate it is to do a thing that's good anyway, which is make sure that everyone can talk to a lawyer for a couple of hours before they go into these hearings. Make sure that they have a chance to, they don't need to be in a hearing together, because it really sucks to be in a room with your rapist, but be able to submit questions to the student disciplinary board to really be able to get at what you see as inconsistencies in the opposing parties' narrative. And I think that would help everyone. If you look at lawsuits from students who are both accused and who reported, they tend to ask for the same things. We want unbiased decision makers. We wanted to know what our rights were. And my hope is that that's going to make both for a better reality on the ground and sort of a more reasonable conversation in the public lens.
Right. So as a member of the media, I wish I could lead to the defense of the media. But I think the Rolling Stone story about UVA really, unfortunately, vividly dramatizes the problems Alexander's talking about, where you have a reporter seeking out the most kind of lurid tale, which frankly, wasn't all that plausible on its face. I know you've talked about this previously, that Sabrina Rubin-Early, the reporter of that story, talked to Alexandra, went to other universities, wasn't interested in the more garden variety spinach and potatoes stories. So that's sort of exhibit A for this problem, and I think that while much of that whole saga is just, unfortunate, it has actually, I think, retaught us all a lesson, which we should have known earlier, but about the importance of reporting these stories very carefully and from multiple vantage So I suppose that's the silver lining. I also think one of the problems with media coverage in this area, and I'll have to make sure to say this delicately, but sometimes people who come forward and put themselves in the media spotlight are not the people who are the most representative of a problem, or maybe people who are seeking attention. And I don't mean to say that about everyone in that position. I write often about people who I have enormous respect for and become very fond of in the course of getting to know them, but that does happen sometimes, and I've experienced that in this particular domain. And then I think, your point about procedural fairness and how it's in everyone's interest is exactly right, and then the question is sort of how do we get there? And part of what we're seeing right now is, 2011 is only 4 years ago. This is a lot of work that's getting done very quickly, and I feel optimistic about where the schools will end up in a few years, but it's messy getting where they need to go, and unfortunately, a lot of students who are experiencing the process now are experiencing it with a lot of imperfections on the side of the complaining students, and also on the side of kids who are accused.
So, in response to your answers, I'm going to go off the script for a second. I'm not very good at that, so you're just going to just bear with me as I articulate the question. But a number of things struck me about both of your responses, and one is the sort of Spanish potatoes line, which is like, you noticed the media response is like, you give them what they want. They don't want Spanish potatoes, they want red meat, right? So how do you, okay, so the question is, right, on the one hand, what you're telling us is, the media wants to double dip, right? It wants to find the most lurid, prurient, right? Sort of the most detailed graphic sex question, dip one, and then knock it down and go after the credibility, because then they get more profit, right? People, more clicks, more so isn't this like kind of a cultural question of how do you? I don't know exactly what the point of intervention is, right? But it's like, yes, the media generates these sensationalist stories, but that's how the media makes a buck. And that's what people want to read. And I think I'm also thinking about, and really no insult to whoever organized the poster for bringing us here tonight was a kind of graphic woman with a tape on her mouth, and sort of like, right, that didn't really bring the audience. It brought you guys here, but right, like when I was thinking, this is often the case that there's sort of these vaguely pornographic images that are used to sort of weirdly promoting the thing that they're supposed to condone. And okay, so I'll leave it there. That's an example of question.
Yeah, I think those are good points. I think there are two things. For me as a reporter, sometimes dramatic stories, even if they're not common, are worth telling because you're exploring these questions. And I think, in all fairness to the picking through GChat's impulse that a lot of publications have had, those are sources of communication. They can be pretty interesting. You're hearing people's voices in real time, and I think readers tend to get involved too in trying to piece through evidence and make sense of it themselves. The popularity of the podcast Serial this fall is an example, a really successful one in a slightly different context. So one thing you can do as a reporter, if you're telling a story that is basically a man bites dog story, is to hang a big sign on it in one of the early paragraphs that you're writing a story that isn't really about maybe anything else, or it has lessons, but it's also atypical. So I did that for a story that I wrote for the Times Magazine a couple months ago about a student at Stanford who got involved with her undergraduate mentor. It wasn't a typical story, and so we just said that really high up. And I think when you're dealing with a new-ish issue, it's okay to have narratives out there. It's probably a good thing that we can all kind of view as various litmus tests. Okay, well, here's this fact pattern. This is a way that law students learn a lot of times. Sort of the common law model in the legal system, where you don't necessarily have courts merely interpreting statutes. You also have them getting wisdom through cases that they then kind of collectively amass and share, and that's how they come to different conclusions about what legal standards should be. We're sort of in the middle of one of those periods, but again, it's not a sort of kind of clean process. And it does run the risk of giving audiences a sense that certain types of stories are much more common than they really are. I think that these are kind of fevered moments, and then the fever breaks, essentially. So this happened a few years with bullying. There were a lot of stories in the news about bullying causing suicide. They They were very black and white and kind of flattened. Some of them were pretty wrong, and from the point of view of a statistical phenomenon, the real risk factor for suicide among teenagers is depression. It's kind of boring, it's always been true, but what you really need to do, the most effective way to prevent suicide among teenagers is to provide more mental health services and better suicide prevention warning trainings. So, you know, should students also get as much as possible? Should you prevent severe bullying? Sure, but not only because in a few rare cases it has this really tragic result. I kind of think we're going to get through this moment of sexual assault reporting to a different place too. It's just like we haven't made it to the other end. And to some degree, it just depends on the outlet. And as you know, readers and listeners and viewers, this depends on what you choose to take in.
Yeah. So I'm not anti-story. I say that jokingly, but I've heard after sort of a co-optation of a certain feminist rhetoric from administrators at Yale saying, oh, all of these stories are always sort of semi-pornographic, all of these stories are essentializing, therefore students should never tell their stories, which seems a little bit self-interested when you're an administrator at a university. With that being said, and I do think these fact patterns, as Emily has said, can be helpful, but we're only seeing some of the fact patterns, and we're only seeing parts of the fact patterns that we do see. So what we end up with is not just sort of a non-random collection of stories, but only pieces of them. And I think that there are a couple of things that we all can do. I think that's something that reporters can do, is find the drama in interactions between institutions and wronged people. So I think it's a pretty good story when you can find, a dramatic story, a clickbaity story, when you can find a really powerful institution like a university that has wronged a student and that student has fought back. But inevitably when students, not inevitably, often I hear from students who talk to reporters who say, I want to tell you about the things that the school did to me, what they said to me, the services that they provide. The requirement for having that story go forward is for the student to tell their story, and their story is necessarily the act of violence. It is not the story of fighting back. It is not the story of taking action against an institution. So I think that that's on reporters to be more creative and give readers more credit for what they want to hear. A tip that I just heard from a psychiatrist who works with newspapers is also for readers, if they see a story that they think is done really well, to contact the paper. Because often if you see a story that's really respectfully reported, that really treats the victim as a full human being, that delves into nuance, that's probably not going to get as many Facebook hits as the story that with the title, "You'll Never Believe What Happened to This Freshman." But if the editor hears, "I really appreciated what you did here," particularly at local papers, that can make a big difference.
This is the kind of choose your own adventure part of the evening. Within a limited set. So, there have been a lot of, there's been a lot of discussion about changes to university sexual misconduct policy, and university responses. And so, what I'm thinking of are affirmative consent standards, bystander intervention, and default expulsion. So I pushed all of them, but where do you want to go first?
Those are three different things.
I think that maybe we can do affirmative consent and bystander intervention together.
That sounds good.
Great. So maybe I'll just sort of leave it open and say, can you guys tell us a little about what is the discussion on affirmative consent? Right, should constantly be talking as I'm having sex to make sure it's consensual, right? And then also, and what is bystander intervention? Why are people so excited about it? What does it entail? And also, how do you think? What are the problems, possibilities, and strategies?
Yeah, so what I think is interesting and why I thought it might make sense to talk about these together is that these are sort of the two silver bullets that people keep putting out there. Like, no one will ever be raped again if we have affirmative consent and or bystander.
That plus like the chastity belt. Honestly, like every week someone sends me either an app or like some new invention that's going to solve this. It's an underwear that's going to lock. That, yes, those security cameras, there are many such fixes.
which might not be fair. But so the idea of affirmative consent is that you actually have to say, if you want to have sex with someone, they actually have to say yes for that to be okay. You can't just sort of go at it until they say no. And to me, that seems like a really obvious idea, because if we go by the no means no model, it means that everyone is literally consenting to everyone all of the time until they manage to say no, and that's obviously not true. People get caught up on some of the sort of pushing affirmative consent to a logical extreme that I think doesn't actually reflect the way that people have sex. So if you read, there's recently a piece in Elle magazine where the woman is saying that you have to say, yes every 15 seconds. If you have to sign out a dotted line, that's really taking everything that's sexy out of sex. And I would agree, luckily that's not what affirmative consent requires people to do. I think what it really just does is requires people to want the person they are sleeping with to also want to be doing all of those things, and to kind of take it from that first principle. My main concern is just that there are also coerced yeses. There are people who say yes because they don't have the option of saying no. And so it was funny that Emily mentioned the ads, because as affirmative consent was starting to become popular, I got a whole bunch of emails from 18-year-old freshman dudes saying, I created this ad where people can sign a contract saying they've agreed to have sex, because that's what affirmative consent is. Part of the thought was just, when does that happen? Like, at what point do you just pull out your phone and be like, please don't accuse me of raping you later on? But it also, part of my concern there was, what if you're in an abusive relationship and the person says, you have to sign this, or, I'm going to do, whatever the threat is. And so, I think that affirmative consent is better than not affirmative consent, but I also feel like it's really a basement for sexual respect, and that we can do a lot better to sort of affirm the autonomy of our partners. On bystander intervention, the basic idea is that when people see a situation unfolding that looks unsafe, that they should feel empowered to go and intervene in that situation. The sort of White House PSA version of this is that there's a drunk girl on a couch, and some guy is sketchily trying to get her into his room, and someone else comes in and stops that. I think that people should do that. Don't let drunk girls be carried into rooms by strange men. That's not how I hear a lot of stories of violence on campus. That is literally never the story I hear. And so I worry a little bit that by fixating on the sort of public experiences of violence, we're ignoring the ways that we all have an ethical responsibility to intervene in the culture that creates violence, and to intervene in, because we're not going to always be able to be there in the moment.
So I, in the fall, did a lot of reporting with Yale students about how they were absorbing the ideas of affirmative consent and the workshops and bystander intervention that all the sophomores at Yale go through. And I came away feeling like the students were receptive to the bystander intervention training in a way that seemed heartening to me. I don't think that they saw it as limited to like that last second in the way you were describing it. I understand what you mean, but I think they actually were feeling like it had more to do with the culture, in the sense that they were talking about being at a party or at something I learned was called WOADS, which is Wednesday Night at Toads, which did not exist when I was an undergraduate back 8 million years ago. And at Wednesday Night at Toads turns out to be sort of like, you go and drink and you dance, and there's like a lot of possibility of hooking up kind of in the air, so I learned. And so a lot of the students were saying that what they had absorbed from this workshop and this consciousness they had was that you should be looking out for your friends at that event. And if you saw someone who seemed to be, out of it, and someone approaching them too aggressively, you should like step in and ask, and maybe it should extend not just to your friends, but to anyone who you saw in a kind of compromising situation. And that their sort of hope was that if you had a world in which more people were vigilant and kind of looking out in that way, and not assuming that every sexual overture was wanted or that it was none of their business, that there would be fewer opportunities for the kinds of situations that lead up to sexual assault. So I found that pretty heartening. I don't know what you think about it. Mostly because the students seemed to feel like it was possible. Whereas the students I was interviewing here found affirmative consent to be pretty confusing. And while I agree with you, was part of, or at least was sympathetic to arguing when this idea got a lot of publicity in the fall because California adopted as a rule for California schools. It's not a law, state law, but for colleges and universities. There was some, I think, good defending of affirmative consent is like, look, communicating during sex can be sexy, like sort of the opposite of what you were arguing before. And I think the students I was interviewing could imagine that as an ideal, but it seemed sort of unrealistic to them because they were having sex, or at least thinking about having sex in a situation where they didn't necessarily feel all that comfortable or know the person that well. And so the idea that they were going to be like checking in and asking for a yes in this very sweet, sensitive way felt a little out of reach to them. It seemed like sort of mystifying. So then I started wondering, like, how realistic is this really? Does it seem, is it just one of those things that's going to seem like a great fix for us, but actually is not going to affect the reality of, you know, sexual relationships on campus?
So, I think, so my thought on your take on bystander intervention, how recursive can I get, is that that's not the violence that that's not the lead up to violence that I saw when I was an undergrad, and that's not what I'm hearing. So I think that the popular narrative is that, like, two sort of acquaintances or strangers get drunk when, you know, they take each other home from the party and something bad unfolds there. And the majority of the violence that I have heard of, directly and indirectly, is between two people who have a consensual, intimate relationship that does not involve all possible sexual acts, and that during an intimate encounter, one of those other acts occurs. And so my concern is that when we're only able to conceive of the lead up as two drunk people at a party, we sort of forget about all the ways that we can help prevent those the majority of instances. And I don't think that means that we shouldn't have bystander intervention. In my dream world, we would just have that as part of a larger conversation about sort of the diversity of violence and the diversity of solutions that are necessary, which includes, if your friend is in an abusive relationship, what are the ways that you can connect that person to support to help them leave if that's something that they're interested in. So my objection is not that it shouldn't happen, but it should be one of so many things that are happening.
But it's incomplete. Yes, way to improve.
Yes. And maybe I'm going to sound like my mother here, but I feel like if you can't talk about sex, you probably shouldn't be having it. And I'm okay sacrificing an 18-year-old's one-night stand because they don't know how to, because they don't feel like they can say, do you want to do this, if it means that the other 18-year-old isn't getting raped.
I think you are young enough to deliver that message.
I think I'll limit it to two more questions and then we'll open it up. I want to follow up on what you're saying about sort of, you know, what I think of as consent is necessary and insufficient. And cards on tables, like you're ready to my position. But here's the question. Also just a point of clarification. I think, if I may know, the California law and the Yale policy and both policies, it's not a verbal requirement. So affirmative consent is freely given, voluntary agreement or something, which I think is where the confusion comes in. It's some level above not saying no, but it's not kind of clear what that level.
You can use your body language.
Sure.
Yes,
Right. Right, and also just sort of not to be pedantic, right? But this is a point of confusion that the California law is about school policies and social misconduct at universities, and it is not, you know, it is not the standard. It's not the standard for criminal sexual assault, right? So the worst thing that happens to you is you get expelled, right? You don't go to prison for not securing affirmative consent.
Well, in fact, it was a rule adopted that the governor was telling the schools they would lose their funding if they didn't adopt it.
But so the question about, you know, consent more generally. No, I won't go through the whole story. I don't guess. It's your kind of mind. Here's the issue, right? There's a sort of I worry about the way, and this worry comes from a legacy of feminist thinkers and activists, right? That the way that consent can be both over-inclusive and under-inclusive, and so by under-inclusive, I mean exactly what Alexander was saying, right? Some of the worst forms of sexual coercion, intimate partner violence, unwanted sex, even just really crappy sex, is all sort of fall in the ambit of what we think of as consensual, and certainly what the law usually thinks of as consensual. So how do you deal with that? And kind of the over-inclusive, I really just mean, teenagers, right? In some states, in some jurisdictions, maybe some people with cognitive disabilities. Right? There's this really interesting article in the New York Times this morning that you should all read. It's kind of fascinating about a woman with Alzheimer's and many things. Right, so this over-inclusive, under-inclusive problem, I'm thinking about Rubenfeld, and if I'm at a bar and I say I went to Yale, I went to Wesleyan to go home with you, is that consent? And, okay, so we might all agree that kind of consent, we might all agree that consent is like a necessary mechanism in law, right, as opposed to say force. But like, do we need consent in our activism? Our activism on sexual violence and creating a better sexual climate? Like, why are we so much on $5 words magnetized to consent? How else can we think about this? Or should we are wrong? We should just keep on the consent train.
So I think that there's this really interesting way in which consent is both the easiest thing and the hardest thing. So consent is a short word. People generally think that they have a sense of what it means to consent to something. Saying yes seems like a very direct act. Where if we use other language, like I know when you talk about sexual autonomy, you say that to an 18-year-old, and I have no idea what that word means. And it involves a really serious grappling that isn't possible when you're headed home with someone. So I think that activists like it because it's pithy, because it's catchy, because they can explain it in a sentence. Until you actually start grappling with different scenarios and wondering, was there consent here? How do we understand how power interacts with this? How do we understand the ways in which yeses may be insufficient? So I guess part of my hope is that we can recognize in our own personal lives that there's a difference between slogans and truth. And that I hope that we can get our slogans to be as true as possible, but that we always need to accept that political explanations of sex are going to be insufficient for personal use.
I think that's right. Sex is more complicated and interesting and nuanced than the slogans allow for. And I guess what I would add to that is I think there's all this really interesting conversation we had about good sex versus bad sex, about how to help young people enjoy sex, have sex that makes them happy, with all the communication challenges that arises. And then there's this question of legal sanctions and what should the standard be for suspending or expelling a kid or for putting someone in prison. And I want those to be much more kind of walled off, higher barriers. Most of the conversation does not need to enter into that realm. And sometimes I think the challenge is to realize that you can have a conversation about promoting good, enjoyed sex on campus that doesn't actually have to be about like, who are we going to sanction, who are we going to punish? But sometimes those conversations are kind of happening at the same time in a confusing way.
So that's great. I really do want to open up. I guess I want to leave with sort of open-ended the vision for the future question. Like what should happen next? I'm thinking about that White House report that came out last year, where from White House. All of that sort of best practices, right? So maybe we're going to get this sort of data-based approach, and we're going to figure out what the best practices are to minimize sexual violence on campus. And right there, sort of best practices is a language from harm reduction work, which is supposed to sort of cut through all the kind of ideological crap, and like it's not going to be partisan, we're really going to find out how to solve this. And so kind of in that mode and spirit, like what are the best practices? And also, what's the goal? I mean, that sounds like a kind of obvious question, but I wonder what is the goal, and what are the best practices to get there?
Right, I'll try and start. I mean, the goal is more equality on campus. That's what Title IX is about, and it's a worthy goal. And the question is how to get there. I think Alexander's right that these procedures are going to get fairer and more robust. Title IX is here to stay. I was kind of have flirted in past months with the idea of like maybe schools just really can't handle this at all, and we need to go get them to cooperate more with the police. I I think the police have an important role to play in some of these cases, and if someone's committed a serious criminal act, then that's a parallel system that needs to be activated, usually. But I also think that there are a lot of cases that are as much about creating a good environment for students on campus. And the campuses are places that are different from the rest of the world. They are places that students come to learn, their communities in a different way. It makes sense that they have their own rules and sets of obligations for protecting students. So I'm not flirting so much with just sort of giving up on this whole washing our hands of this mess. And the other reason I feel that way is I actually think some schools are really making a lot of progress and things are getting fairer. I feel terrible for the students who have been caught in the wheels as this has been happening. I think, there have been kids whose lives have been severely damaged by the school's inadequacies thus far, and that's a real cost. But I do think some really smart people at these schools are starting to think this through, and I don't think this should happen at this moment, but in a couple of years, I hope the Office of Civil Rights does provide guidelines about best procedural practices based on what some of the schools are doing and their experiences. And I guess the other reform I think is really important is to rethink how confidentiality has, the role that it's played. So one reason why schools can never give any details about these cases, or they're not supposed to, is the federal privacy law. The acronym is FERPA, who knows what that stands for. But in any case, some schools have interpreted it very broadly to mean they can't comment at all, they can't give out statistics, and I think that's a real mistake. We should have some sense of the outcomes in these cases, the same as we do in civil litigation and criminal litigation, because we learn from these outcomes and how whoever is judging a student's complaint, why they came out the way they should, the way they did. And also students on both sides can be left at a tremendous disadvantage when the process is so opaque that nobody really understands what the outcome was about and why. And I think that confusion is causing harm unto itself. And finally, we're dramatically missing statistics. So, one question that I confront all the time is should we be more worried right now about the girls or the boys? Are the girls still experiencing being mistreated as victims to just wildly centralize and forget about all the other permutations of this? Is that the problem, or are we seeing more cases in which accused boys are having their rights kind of thrown under the bus? I have a gut instinct about that, but it's anecdotal. I don't know the answer because we don't have statistics about how many cases schools are adjudicating, what the outcomes are, and what the sanctions are. And the government hasn't created a mechanism in which schools are required to report those things. There's some reporting in particular kinds of instances under another law called the Clery Act, but honestly, it's inadequate and sort of confusing how those counts even happen. So that's one change I would like to see.
Yeah, so I think that a lot of the changes that need to be made on campus looking toward the future are just not that exciting to talk about.
I just was really excited.
What do you mean?
Yes.
Not what Emily was just talking about, but a lot of the, okay. So here's the question that I've been trying to figure out. I'm writing a paper on this, which is at what day between notice and the hearing do you give both parties the full statement from the other? Literally, is it day 3? Is it day 8? No one wants to talk about this question. And I think that it's important. I think it's important. I think that maybe the answer is that we need to give schools and lawyers and policymakers and advocates some time to go just figure out what's going on, figure out best practices, have some debates, and that's not going to make for a really compelling media narrative. We just have to be okay with it. In terms of a sort of larger and perhaps more inspiring call to action, I think that one of the most important things that we have learned from this moment, victim survivor organizing, is that people want options outside of the criminal justice system. That often the services that they're looking for, the solutions they are looking for, and the platform that they are looking for to say, I was harmed in this way, are actually better provided through civil rights law than I know that often people talk about Title IX as this totally ridiculous aberration where, why do schools handle this when that wouldn't happen anywhere else? And that's actually not true. So Title VII is the analogous anti-discrimination law for employers. And while for a number of reasons you don't see the same rates of reports being brought to employers for sexual assault that you see being brought to schools, there's an analogous function, and we can imagine how more robust enforcement of Title VII could address the needs of a whole other range of people who aren't protected by Title IX. But that gets us students, and that gets us employees, and only employees of certain kinds of workplaces that are sort of large enough. But back in the day, the Original Violence Against Women Act, there was a federal civil right of action for everyone. So it was sort of like everyone had Title IX. And that's an imperfect analogy because not everyone could go tell a body that would then, other than a court who would then adjudicate. But what it meant was that victims of gender-based violence and a wide range of forms of gender-based violence could take a stand in federal court and sue for monetary damages, and that money can make a really big difference for people who, in the wake of violence, need services, need to pay for a therapist, all of that. And it also allowed us to address violence as a problem of gender equality as a way of entrenching sex castes. And we gotta bring it back. I don't know how it's gonna happen.
Struck down.
Or struck it down, but we gotta bring it back.
So I think I'll leave it there, Ryan. Yeah. Thank you guys very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I don't know if that's what the time window is, but I guess we open up to questions, and if I see your hand, I'll call you. Go ahead.
So I'm a parent who's having a
There's a mic coming your way.
Oh, wonderful.
Hi.
So I'm a parent who's having a child go off to college in the fall. And when you go on a college tour, you get to be protected with a blue light, which is an interesting thing. But I have some assumptions that you are three people who think about this issue, and I wanted to check some of my assumptions. I see a lot of societal change with the use of social media as a tool sometimes for young adults to handle conflict or to avoid conflict, face-to-face conflict. That they're a new way of learning how to communicate with each other about intimacy or not intimacy, being mediated through their phones. I see fewer kids dating compared to a previous generation. I don't know, I could be episodic, it seems to be true to me. When I was in school, there wasn't a term called hooking up. And so
there was the practice.
There was the practice. I think it's got more.
Not the word.
It feels more robust and kind of socially sanctioned, in some perspective. And I think as college students are going to college campuses and having access to dorm rooms and alcohol and kind of rite of passage ritual of like, wanting to not perceive themselves as children, but as fully functioning, robust adults through sex. I see that college campuses, it shocks me that there isn't more incidents of lack of communication and sexuality, and more misunderstanding, more hurt feelings, more violence that gets reported and not gets reported. It seems like it's a tremendously challenging arena that's, seems to be even more difficult now.
I just wonder if you might, and actually talk about the AAU, is that the acronym? The sexual assault time survey, and the data's being released on Saturday. It's related to, it is your question, actually.
Yeah, the politics are also interesting. So I don't feel qualified to speak to changes in dating patterns. The one thing that I'll say is that my impression is that people had sex before we did, and also this is a ridiculous story, but so my parents were monogamous until they got engaged, and I actually think that dating patterns have shifted, but there's not such a clear narrative. I think that young people who are dating now are more likely to be monogamous if they are in a relationship, and there's just a higher threshold to getting into that relationship. think that rape is happening because of misunderstandings. I don't think it's happening because of miscommunications.
So those things also happen.
I think that those things also happen, but I think that that is, I don't think, when I think of the problem, it is not young men who don't understand that who think that the young women want to sleep with them and are wrong. And I also don't think that sex is the cause of violence. I think that it's true that being sexually active puts young people at risks for certain kinds of violence that they might not otherwise face, so that's not universally true. There are people who are not otherwise intimate who are facing violence, and I think that the best tool as a parent there, and I imagine that this leads to some kind of awkward conversations, but is to talk to students about what really great sex would look like as they're heading off, just so that they have really high standards for how their partner should treat them and feel empowered when they think that maybe they want to say no, to feel like they can say no.
Yeah, that's a good goal. So I have two boys who are 15 and 12, and so having a mother who goes and writes books about bullying and writes constantly about sexual assault is like it's not their favorite quality about me, but it makes me very aware of these issues as they come up. And my kids are really not interested in hearing me yammer on to them about anything related to sex, but they do like to watch movies and TV shows. And so one of the things that I try to be aware of is what they're absorbing from those moments. And we forced them to watch an 80s film called Say Anything, which I had basically forgotten about, but as we were watching it, there's a sex scene in that movie where the male star, Don Cusack, actually kind of tears up and starts to cry because he's really moved by having sex for the first time with this girl he's super in love with. And my husband looked at my sons and said, that's being a gentleman. And it was very sweet that, he was kind of calling out this moment of male vulnerability as a model for my kids. I have no idea whether they took this in or not, but I was very chucked. I will just throw that out there. Go watch Say Anything with your teenage boys, and then you can watch Friday Night Lights too, which as far as I'm concerned should be a health class or teenage ethics class curriculum, because every dilemma gets posted along the way. There's lots of good conversational fodder in it.
After that, I kind of leads to my question. I actually have a daughter who went to Yale, about 5 years ago, and so it was really 10 to about 10 years ago when she was there, or whatever, 9 years ago. And she would, and then I guess it's been the last 5 or 6 years, and all this has been coming up, and she would say, thank God, Yale's finally addressing this issue. And I remember her talking about this, out of the blue. I wish that she really had this, knew firsthand or whatever experience that she would relay of friends who've had multiple incidences with the jocks or the this or these guys at Yale. And she was always saying it's because they're Yaleys, the guys are Yaleys. In addition to being a boy, they're at Yale, and they have this mentality that they're just gods, because they're the best of the best, the cream of the crop to be able to be at Yale, and it's just makes it even worse. It's tough enough being the boy in 1920, whatever, to have this. This was her opinion here, and thank God she's saying they're at Yale. So, and it would make me think of kind of what you were talking about, thinking, how can schools, I guess 2 questions. One is there really this, is it more risk to be, usually it's boy, be more dominant, at a high elite school where the guys already, have this mental attitude of being the best, and cream of the crop, or is it really, does make a difference in Yale versus some other school. And number 2, in terms of what the schools are doing, and I like the bystander program they're working on at Yale, is it really is just kind of teaching, just sitting in front of a TV show and learning how to be a gentleman? I mean, is it that kind, is there that piece also missing, that training for these, boys to be not, to learn how to treat a lady? I know it sounds very anachronism, but, is that a training that the schools need to be develop with? Or is this really just so outlandish?
I'm glad you brought up that piece of history, because one thing that we're aware of, but I'm not sure we really talked about that much, is how much history there has been at universities of not dealing with this issue. I started writing about this topic at Yale in 2004, and that's not that long ago, and there was just no question that the university was, disorganized to the point of negligence, like with almost every complaint of sexual assault that it was getting, and it was bad, but I also don't think that Yale was, stood out for that. I think that schools across the country essentially didn't really want to touch this. They were basically not taking this seriously, not seeing situations that the kind that Alexander described, in which two people know each other and then there is a sexual assault. They just didn't really believe that counted as rape, and they diminished it as a result. And it was really tough on a lot of mostly young women, but some young men who went through those experiences. So that history should be informing this current conversation. We need to remember it. I don't really think that men at elite schools are more likely to commit sexual assault. I don't think I haven't seen any proof of that. I think that for everyone in this conversation, it will only help if we, help boys as they grow up be feminists, like in some deep sense, where they are valuing women's autonomy and equality and seeing women as like real people who they take seriously and whose feelings they care about. I'm sure many of you do this already, but the message I care about giving to my kids is like, you should enjoy sex, the person you're sleeping with should enjoy it, and you'll be more likely to both enjoy it if you care about each other, I think. And I also feel like if that means you have less sex, like, that's okay. I mean, of course I do, I am their mother. And they don't have to take in all of that at the moment that lesson is being imparted for me to hope that at some point they'll remember it. And some of this, again, is not so much about like preventing them from becoming the sort of cartoon accidental rapist, which I agree with Alexandra. I don't really think that's a real fear for them or for other young men, but I just want them to be in healthy, good relationships and treating other people with respect. And that seems like the more sort of the goal that is going to affect more of their life, I hope.
I agree that I don't think that we have the statistics to know whether elite schools have higher rates of violence than less competitive schools. But I do think that there's a conversation about privilege there that's really important, and that male privilege is one factor in that, but there are many others that contribute. So I know that when I was an undergrad and everyone sort of knew who the repeat rapists were, they were exclusively white men who gone to private schools in New York or LA. I can name the schools to you. And I think that's, and a lot of them were legacy students whose parents had also gone to Yale. And it kind of makes intuitive sense that if you know that your parents are going to call a lawyer, a really good lawyer, if you get into trouble, that you're a little less careful with the people around you.
So, yeah, right. So a couple of thoughts. One is, it does seem like impunity is not talked about enough, right? Like, sort of like the frat phenomenon is talked about a lot, and alcohol is talked about a lot, especially impunity, I think doesn't get its fair share. On the other hand, do you guys think it's fair to say that really the difference between a place, say like Yale and I don't know, Penn State or something? Maybe it's a terrible example, which is why I thought of that there's more resources, right? So actually, a place like Yale has more resources to address the problem than perhaps another schools, right? So
Well, one way in which that's playing out is that Yale and Harvard, and actually Harvard Law School right now, are trying to put a lot of of the University of Montana blueprint on this too, which is, obviously a state school from a different part of the country. So, like,
How's that? I read a lot about this because I work with students who are planning to go to college. So I've read tons and tons of stories, and as you pointed out, most of them are that have to do with alcohol, and what is consent and all of that. But other things that I read, I can't remember where I read just the other day about, I can't remember which college it was, where they wanted to not have students on the panel. And so my question is about, how do they choose people who are going to be on the panel, and what kind of training do they get? And is it reasonable to have one panel for everyone? What if that's your professor? What if that's a friend? What if that's a person down the hall who really doesn't like you? I mean, how does this work when they're not professionals?
That's a great question.
Yeah, and this looks really different in a lot of different schools. So Emily was just talking about this Harvard Law School plan that a lot of people are hoping was going to be some kind of model, and they actually outsource some of this decision making to external people, so
like
that
retired judges,
right, who are never going to be your roommate or your professor. I am sort of a lukewarm response to that, in part because part of the project of school discipline is deciding a community's norms and a community's membership, and I like the idea of the community being involved with that. I think that there are a lot of schools that have kind of a roster of people that can make these decisions so that it's a big enough group that people can conflict out if necessary. That raises questions about, if you're in a small community, is it just inevitable that everyone is going to know everyone? I personally also think that this should be part of the same structure that hears all student disciplinary issues, though there should be people who are particularly trained to deal with sexual misconduct, just as there are people who should be particularly trained to deal with racial harassment or disability-based harassment or people who punch their roommates in the nose, just because these bring up different kinds of challenges. But I do think that getting a wide range of perspectives and also not treating sexual violence as a totally separate special issue can actually help us gain expertise from throughout the university.
So this is sort of the jury model, right? Where you're getting the wisdom of the community and you're trusting your peers with these judgments, and there are certainly appeal to that. I am really interested in this Harvard Law School outsourcing idea for a couple of reasons. One is just the independence that provides the decision makers. I think one of the real challenges for the role we're asking universities to play with Title IX is that universities are self-interested corporations. They have to worry about their public image, their donor base, in a way that the criminal justice system does not. And so this idea of having independent adjudicators may make for more fairness by taking it kind of outside the chain of command, as someone I was talking to today put it. So I'll be interested in seeing how that plays out. I don't think we have enough data and experience yet to know which of these models is better. There's an argument for having students on these panels. They can help translate the mystery of social media to us old people, for one thing, and these are their peers, so maybe they should be having a say. On the other hand, there are schools where they've absolutely taken the students off the panels, and I think OCR actually dropped a footnote in one of their reports suggesting that it's not a good idea to have students on panels. Again, these are different models that we need to have more experience with and see the results from to really get a sense of what works best.
It's better, yeah.
Thank you very much. For whatever reason, it may just be coincidence, it seems that the focus tonight has been more on the question of adjudication and what happens to victims and what happens to accused students, and these are really important questions, but I want to turn it in a different direction. So my question is, for a few minutes, each of you is the president of Yale. And you've got resources, but you've got limited resources. And given that a very important goal is to work towards the institution getting to a point where the prevalence of sexual assault is as close to zero as possible, what steps do you take? What are the most important things you can do, given that you don't have $4 million to hire 25 new counselors, right? Where would you put your effort?
I would hire more women faculty members. I would make sure that there were opportunities for women to pursue their research and extracurricular goals with support. And I think I would generally, while putting plenty of money into bystander intervention and consent education and all of that, I would also try to promote gender equality at the university more broadly, both so that women feel like they are able to stand up for the lives and the experiences that they want, and also so that the people that they are interacting with, potentially sleeping with, recognize that women are people.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I don't think you're gonna like this answer very much, but I'm gonna try it anyway. I would be tempted, so I would rather actually be the governor in this hypothetical. I would like to run an experiment of bringing the drinking age back down to 18. Oh,
No, I'm into that.
Good.
For different reasons.
okay, good. You can explain that in a minute. I would like to bring the drinking age back down, bring drinking back onto campus in a way where it's part of campus activities, and see what happens. Maybe it won't work, but I would be really interested. I went to school when the drinking age was 21, but I hear a lot of stories from people who are older than me about, like drinking in the common room or this, and that it was a much more normalized part of student life, and that there was much less binge drinking. And I would like to see if we could go back to that, at least on college campuses where kids aren't driving, and see what happens. Now, why do you think that's a good idea?
We both started doing that. Right? So I think for me it's that when drinking is pushed off campus, it's pushed into male-dominated spaces. And I worry about that both because the men then have greater access in that moment, but also because it makes it much harder to call people out and to disrupt sites of violence when then you don't get invited to the party. So if, when I was an undergrad, there were guys who everyone sort of knew kept being classmates, but threw good parties with a lot of free alcohol and drugs, and so no one really said anything just because they wanted to keep getting invited. But if that person was going with you to the party thrown by the school in the common area, I think we would all have felt like we could have done a lot more within our own social spaces.
So one of the ways in which students are starting to address this actually is the discussion about shifting parties into sororities and away from fraternities, which is happening here.
Am I supposed to take mine?
Yeah.
So I'll think that if I were a dictator, maybe not really. I actually, I'm so much better as a critic, but I think in a weird way we still inhabit a wildly eronophobic, sex-phobic world, despite all the sort of talk about sex and media coverage around sex. I think it would be a cool experiment to think about sexual literacy classes and what good sex would look like, which doesn't need to be monogamy in the couple form and treating like a lady. It could also be like stuff about health and reproduction and contraception and what. And I think that there's sort of a bigger problem, which is this sort of complete and continuing impoverishment of sexuality education, which has only gotten moderately better under the Obama administration. And I don't think it's a silver bullet, but I think sort of that if you can have a truly comprehensive sexual education that is also about being critical media readers of gender roles, of the kind of lessons you're getting from Friday Night Lights or wherever else, right? Is that the name of the show?
Yeah.
Right. So I still think a lot of discussion is how to say no and not what's the kind of sex that we want to be having and why. I think that may go some distance.
You need to be like King of the Netherlands. Seriously, it's figured out.
But wait, there was someone. Yeah, go ahead.
So first, a quick comment on that. You might want to take a look at Yale in the 70s when the drinking age was 18 and when Philip and Norma Sorrell were teaching sexual literacy to students and see what it was like.
Who knew it was paramedic?
It was. I work as a consultant to the Association of Student Conduct Administrators, who are the folks who are on the ground creating the structures for adjudication, not only for sexual assault cases, but for all of the cases, the types of cases, Alexander, that you were describing. And one of the challenges that they are facing is in the court of public opinion, there's not a lot of nuance and not a lot of deep understanding of the issues that you've been talking about tonight. And those opinions are starting to inform or misinform legislators who are creating legislation to try to dictate processes and so on. And I'm wondering what you would advise as an alternative to that. How can we either get legislation to not be dictating, or how can we create more informed legislation?
There are so many bad ideas in state legislative houses right now. There are a number of states that are trying to get all sexual misconduct cases referred to the police, which just everyone tells us we'll just drive down reporting to anyone at all. I just saw a bill was introduced in the California State House to impose mandatory minimums for sexual assault cases on campus, which, if we've learned anything from the criminal justice system, is that mandatory minimums are a terrible idea.
Sexual assault, sexual misconduct cases.
Sexual assault cases.
So if there's sexual assault, but only on campus.
But only on campus.
There's sexual assault not on campus. There's no mandatory minimum.
Or the disciplinary hearing.
So it's so
like
violation of the.
So it's not if you are found responsible for sexually assaulting someone under a student conduct code, you have to be suspended for at least 2 years. And like I think that generally, if you assault a classmate, you should probably be suspended for at least 2 years. But as you're saying, there are often nuances that the people who are actually on the ground dealing with these cases will see that a legislator imagining all possible scenarios, which I mean mostly just imagining the gang rape at UVA, are trying to imagine. I think that it's super important to write a lot for public consumption.
Alexander does very well.
And to write letters to state legislators. And I think that my suggestion would be for anyone who is doing this work actually on the ground to set up a meeting with whoever their local rep is, even preemptively, to say, you know, here's what I'm experiencing, maybe this is what I think could be helpful for you, but also please don't sort of react to spectacle instead of what we're really experiencing. And I do think that state legislators are receptive to that. It's just that they have a lot of people saying this is an issue I care about and aren't getting a lot of concrete ideas.
I would just add to that, there's some things that are really hard to legislate about effectively, and this is, the Title IX regime has strengths and weaknesses, strengths that we haven't really tapped yet. So that's an example of a law that I think has been really helpful, but sometimes you just have to not try to legislate a problem away, but deal with it in other kind of social, cultural realms. And I feel like that's a lesson that we need to keep learning over and over again.
A few more. Yeah.
I know that this talk has specifically focused on sexual assaults on campus, but I'm wondering what your thought is about how this is affected by what I see as a lower level of preparedness that students have in many areas with regard to living independently. And this happens to be one slice of it. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and especially at this time of year when I see students who are getting ready to go off to college, and many of them are in a state of shock, as if it's actually going to happen in a way that only seemed abstract and hypothetical before. And I'm also repeatedly surprised at the number of students and families who sometimes think that a student is going to be okay going off to college, having never had experiences away from home except with a grandmother. And so I'm wondering how many students are still feeling the umbilical cord of the cell phone, or a sense that they really don't have to learn to be independent because someone will rescue them, and how that plays out in this scenario.
So this is a major complaint of college administrators, the degree of involvement that parents have when students come to campus, which I think really is different because of people's connections via texting and the phone. And then this question of whether students have been protected in a way that has not allowed them to gain enough independence and autonomy and sense of conflict management as they're going to college. You know, to me, those seem like real phenomena. I also think to some degree, this, you know, there are always these generational divides that emerge in ways in which the youth seem hopeless and and bumbling to older people. We forget about what our own strengths and weaknesses were and what the differences are, because they just seem sort of confusing to us. And I guess the other thing I've been struck by is reading about how one of the reasons college has become so much more expensive is that there's an apparatus of support staff and administrators, which has just really multiplied exponentially. It's not that these colleges are spending more money on faculty and not entirely about sprucing up facilities, but also about this whole support structure. And there are good things that people in those positions can do for students, but I also think that they can be a kind of crutch sometimes, and students are looking for institutions for a lot of help that I don't think that is as familiar to people who are my age and older. I sometimes feel like this is all problematic, and it sounds like in your practice it may seem sort of alarming. I also wonder though if we're being a little harsh on students and towards young people, and not trying to kind of understand enough their perspective on this. And then another sort of element of this is how competitive it's become to get into college, and how hard kids work in high school, and whether they need a break before they get there, whether they're experiencing pressures to a greater degree than we necessarily were. You know, I think and then debt too. So sometimes it seems to me like this is about seeing real ways in which parents are not letting go as much, and not giving students chances to really go off on their own, and that's like that's on us as parents to change that parenting culture. And then some of it has to do with seeing this through the students' eyes, and where they're kind of feeling burdened by parental expectations or social realities, and trying to be more understanding about where they're coming from. Kind of contradictory, perhaps.
There was a lovely bow tie in that
A question about faculty and sexual harassment and gender discrimination. We hear a lot about this. I think the Yale Daily News has another piece in today. I'm just wondering, some of the organizations I belong to, when I apply for privileges, I have to sign a code of conduct. Hospitals, Paul Newman's Whole Game Camp. I'm wondering what the faculty are required to sign, whether this is mentioned in contracting, whether there are proactive measures, some type of code of conduct that they should be party to. Oh, sorry.
I'm not sure what faculty are actually signing at Yale. Do you know the answer to that?
No, it's funny you asked, because all my colleagues keep telling me in different fields, different schools at Yale, that they're going through these like sexual harassment.
Yeah,
trainings.
they're
I haven't. So
well, you're not reading your email. There are definitely required trainings. I mean, I think also the sort of atmosphere on campus has just changed around this. You know, most faculty, or many faculty, I'll use the safe forward are very aware of the power imbalance of student relationships and are just, you know, understand how much they will get in trouble. And I think there's, you know, many more professors leave their door open when they're meeting with students, are trying to really maintain boundaries. It's just a sense that the social expectations have changed and that the kinds of intimate relationships that took place between faculty and some students in the past are just not okay anymore. And when you think about the implications of the power imbalance, that is very real. I think those are, you know, mostly healthy developments, and that's a better environment for most students to study in.
Yeah, I agree. You shouldn't sleep with your students. That seems like a pretty easy call. I think that one actually sort of interesting place where this is playing out is recipients of federal grants are subject to not only the school's anti-discrimination codes, but the anti-discrimination provisions of those grants. So theoretically, an NIH grant could be pulled because one of the sort of faculty researchers was found to have discriminated. I haven't heard of that happening yet, but it's an interesting path that we can see, particularly researchers doing.
I think some of my face, I don't know the data, but I believe at Yale and elsewhere it looks like the sexual misconduct that gets reported, most of the sexual misconduct at the undergrad level is peer-to-peer, and then sexual misconduct at the grad level is like grad, postdoc, grad faculty. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what I've seen, and it makes sense. I mean, I was at Yale as an undergrad and now back as a law student, and I think that there are a number of things that explain those different patterns, both that more people in grad school are married or partnered, so just aren't in intimate social situations in the same way, but also, I mean, I am so unbelievably dependent on my faculty recommenders. I literally depended on them for the money with fellowships after graduation, that in a way that I don't remember undergrad.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, this is like too much gossip. There's plenty of faculty grad student sex, right?
Hopefully not.
But not the grad student, not the advisee of the, right? But often, right, faculty and grad students are sometimes the same age and sort of widely different programs, but you know, I don't think you want to rant about it, but I teach a class called Theory and Politics of Sexual Consent, and I actually and they're all in this undergrad seminar, and their sort of final essay is to evaluate the Yale sexual misconduct policy, and you probably know this, so Yale, among, I think probably this one, most colleges sort of just categorically say no sex between faculty and undergraduate, regardless of whether or not in your class, just it's probably a bad idea. And then Yale has this weird little parenthetical that says, because the undergraduates are immature, or something like that. Like based on their immaturity and vulnerability, you probably shouldn't have sex with them. And like everything we talk in class is about, right? Power and expectations and
growing up, I want them to be
right. And so it's weird that like, sort of that's what it hinges on, like sort of this because clause, which seems sort of incongruous to the whole conversation around policy. But that's fine. Anyway, maybe a last question. Yeah, is that okay?
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about what you think or what you observe around confidentiality of complaints and process and outcomes, and you think you'd be a little more light on that? Good, and how much you accomplish that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is an area of in which significant change and improvement is needed. So some schools have in the past, perhaps less so now, said once you file a complaint to both parties, there's this ironclad rule of confidentiality. You may not speak about this to anyone. There are a couple problems with that. One is that often people, for good reason, want to talk to the community around them about what's happening to them. And the second problem is that when those rules get broken by one side, which often happens, the other party is at a real disadvantage, but may not also want to tempt fate by breaking the rules. And so I've seen a number of cases in which that has played out in ways that seem unfair. And then there's this bigger problem of how can we nationally really come to grips with all of these literally can't understand how they were adjudicated and why certain outcomes were reached. It's like a black box, you know. Why was this particular student found not responsible for sexual assault in the language of the schools, and why was this one found responsible? And as Alexandra said before, the stories that come out in the media tend to be incomplete, in part because of these privacy protections. There are real reasons to protect students' disciplinary records. You can imagine really private information, including health information, being included in those cases. But there has to be some way that a school, at the end of an investigation, can write up the kind of redacted report that has enough detail in it that we can make some kind of sense of the outcome. I think some schools are at least selectively starting to do this. I've read some outcome letters from Stanford where I did a lot of reporting that were pretty detailed. But then I read an outcome letter at Stanford that was like a sentence long and gave really no indication of why the result had been reached. So, you know, in my mind, to the extent the real obstacle here is FERPA, the federal privacy law I described earlier, then, you know, Congress should think about changing FERPA. I have a feeling this has more to do with general counsel's offices kind of over-interpreting FERPA. There's probably room in FERPA for what I am talking about, and I really would like schools to move in that direction. I think an obstacle up until now has been the sense of self-preservation, that if you say very little, then there's less liability. You are going to be criticized less if nobody really knows why you reached a particular decision. But maybe enough trouble has been caused by the very untransparent process that schools will be willing to move a little bit about that on that front. I'm not sure.
The only other little bit I'd add is that the conversations that I have been having about confidentiality recently are students who are worried about who they can tell what to without triggering an investigation. So a lot of students would like to tell their professor who they trust, this scary thing happened to me, I kind of just want to talk about it, but don't want that to then go to a dean, right, who, you know, then suddenly they have a hearing they didn't want. The complicating factor there is that the law depends on the university knowing, which is a technical term, but it means that someone in a certain position of power has to be aware for the student to be able to enforce their rights. And so I don't have a good answer to this, but I think that there are really tricky questions here about to what extent do we prioritize a victim's desire for confidentiality at a given moment against what we know will be his or her legal options after that.
So thank you guys very much. Thank you so much.